Hey everybody, this is chapter 7 of part 2 of Gustav A. Vetter's Dialectical Materialism, a Historical and Systematic Survey. So here we go. It's titled Logic. The field of logic has lately been the scene of an extremely violent controversy among the Soviet philosophers. This is chiefly raged about the question whether the classical formal logic is the only logic, or whether in addition a, quote, dialectical logic is also possible and necessary. But before entering into the details of this dispute, we must first consider a thesis of Lenin's, on which the proponents of dialectical logic chiefly rest their case. This is the Leninist doctrine that the materialist dialectic itself comprises both a logic and a theory of knowledge. New section. Section 1. The materialist dialectic of logic and as theory of knowledge. In the fragment titled On Dialectics, Lenin refers to the materialist dialectic as also playing the part of a theory of knowledge. Quote, dialectics is the theory of knowledge of Hegel and Marxism. This is the, quote, side of the matter, ... to which Plekhanov, not to speak of other Marxists, paid no attention, end quote. End quote, Lenin. And in a footnote to the philosophical notebooks, it is said that the, quote, logic, dialectics, and theory of knowledge of materialism, there is no need of three words, they are all one and the same, end quote, are to be, quote, converted into a single discipline, end quote. Lenin. How, then, are we to construe this unity of dialectic, logic, and epistemology to which Lenin here refers? We already know what is meant by dialectic. It is the theory of the general laws of motion in reality, and therefore falls in the first place under what would otherwise be described as ontology. But how can this dialectic be at the same time both logic and theory of knowledge? The situation becomes rather clear if we refer back to Hegel. Before Hegel, in the opinion of the Soviet philosophers, there was basically nothing except formal logic, which is exclusively concerned with the correctness of thinking and not with the question of its truth. The question, that is, as to whether the content of thought was also in accordance with reality. It was precisely because of this disregard of the material aspect of the thought content that it was described as, quote, formal logic, end quote. Kant had already recognized this abstraction from the content of thought as a weakness in formal logic for which he sought to compensate by his own transcendental logic. But it was only Hegel, so it is held, who first actually created a logic which was not content with the purely formal side of thinking, but also took account of the content of concepts. Since Hegel conceives the absolute as the idea in which thought and being are identical, the science of the absolute is at once both logic and ontology. The dialectical unfolding of the categories in Hegel's science of logic is also at the same time an expression of the process of self-development in the absolute self itself. Now, if like Soviet philosophy we speak of, quote, dialectic instead of, quote, ontology, it will be evident that in Hegel, logic and dialectics immediately coincide. But a further consequence on Hegel's view is that epistemology also coincides with this, quote, dialectic, or, quote, logic, for he regards the process whereby the absolute idea unfolds itself in the categories as being also the process of its own self-knowledge. Thus, when Hegel explains in his logic how the absolute idea attains to knowledge of itself, he is simultaneously providing both a solution to the epistemological problem and a justification of the authenticity of this knowledge in relation to reality. Quote, dialectic for Hegel is therefore at the same time epistemological as well. Now, dialectical materialism seeks to emulate this performance and attempts as usual to improve still further on Hegel in doing so. For in his case, the assimilation of dialectic, logic, and epistemology is effected by recourse to the, quote, idealistic principle of the identity of thought and being, end quote, an error that Marx was the first to correct. In essence, this had already been done by the founders of Marxism in putting the Hegelian dialectic on a materialist basis. A similar identification of dialectic and epistemology, therefore, holds good, in Lenin's opinion, for dialectical materialism also. In his essay on Karl Marx, Lenin observes that, quote, dialectics is understood by Marx, and in conformity with Hegel, includes that what is now called the theory of knowledge, of epistemology, end quote. Lenin. In light of this dictum, Rajan attempts a concrete demonstration of how dialectic, logic, and epistemology coincide in Marxist materialism. Quote, the materialism of Marxist logic lies primarily in the fact that thinking is regarded as a product of a physical organ of the body, namely the human brain. Thought is a function of the brain, whereas idealism separates thinking from matter, ... Marxist philosophical materialism considers thought and the laws and forms thereof as a reflection of the objective material world, ... In opposition to the idealist, ... Dialectical materialism teaches that the objective foundations of logical laws and forms of thought lie in the forms of it being itself, in the forms of the external world and of human practice, ... The laws and forms of being determine the laws and thought forms of logic, ... Since thought is not something alien to nature, but a product thereof, subjective thought and objective nature are governed by one and the same set of laws, and their eventual findings cannot contradict one another. End quote. V.P. Rajan. Since, therefore, thought is a product of nature, the logical laws of thought are copies of natural laws, and thinking can do no more than truthfully reflect what nature is like. In all this, Leninist dialectical materialism is blindly reiterating the Hegelian principle of the coincidence of dialectic, logic, and epistemology without asking itself whether such an equation is still feasible, now that Hegel has been subjected to the materialist, quote, inversion, and, quote, matter has replaced the capital I idea. And in fact, this possibility is no longer open to it. In the first place, so far as assimilation of logic and dialectic is concerned, the impossibility of reconciling this with the dialectical materialist position emerges all too clearly from the very disputes about the relation of formal logic to dialectic which are currently going on among the Soviet philosophers, which we shall shortly be investigating in greater detail. As for the other equivalents, that of dialectic and epistemology, this was possible for Hegel, inasmuch as he regarded being, all being that is, as consisting in its inmost essence of, quote, idea. The self-unfolding of the idea in its being is therefore at the same time the process whereby it comes to self-knowledge, a knowledge which, thanks to the identity of thought and being, must necessarily remain true to reality. But if, quote, matter is now substituted in place of the idea, the argument is no longer applicable, for either consciousness is regarded thereafter as a property of only a part of matter, namely, quote, highly organized matter, in which case being and consciousness are no longer identical. The developmental process in matter in respect of its being is thus no longer immediately coincident with its development in respect of its consciousness. The accordance of consciousness with reality is no longer given eo ipso by its very occurrence, and the problem of the bridge between knowledge and reality is raised once more in its most acute form. Alternatively, despite the, quote, inversion of Hegel, being and thought are again equated, the only difference being that it is now called, quote, matter instead of, quote, idea, and in fact an identification of this sort is not infrequently met with in the epistemological disquisitions of Soviet dialectical materialism, especially where it is said that the, quote, brain is a part of, quote, nature, and hence that in this way, its organ, nature, comes to consciousness of itself, just as the Hegelian, quote, idea does in the case of, quote, spirit. But this would presuppose that, quote, matter, so conceived, is already by origin in some way essentially, quote, consciousness, and does not merely become so in the case of its highest production. In that case, however, we should again have fetched up in Hegel's idealism the whole difference between Hegel and dialectical materialism would be simply a matter of terminology in that, quote, matter or, quote, nature is used instead of the word, quote, idea. The same assimilation of dialectics and epistemology, and this on the ground of a fundamental identity between subjective and objective, is also to be found in Engels' doctrine of the coincidence of objective and subjective dialectics, according to which subjective dialectics, so called, i.e. dialectical thought, is only a reflection of objective dialectics, i.e. the motion through opposites which asserts itself everywhere in objective reality. Engels thereby seeks to combine dialectics with the copy theory. Mark, in criticism of this proposal, points to the unbalance and discordancy between the static character of the copy theory, which presupposes a fixed object of knowledge and hence a similar fixity in knowledge itself, and the dynamism of the dialectical concept of knowledge. Be that as it may, the invocation of the copy theory in order to establish the necessary correspondence between subjective and objective dialectics has no warrant in any case, for this would necessarily presuppose that the dialectical process of knowledge runs absolutely parallel in time to the dialectical process of unfolding in objective reality. Quote, reflection implies simultaneity. If, however, the knowing process is contracted on occasion into a relatively short space of time, we again encounter the full force of the critical problem of knowledge. Namely, what guarantee do we have that it truthfully reflects the process in reality, spread out as this is over an incomparably greater span of time? But that the two processes by no means coincide is already evident from the consideration that the knowing process in many cases ascends from knowledge of effects to knowledge of causes, whereas the process in reality occurs in precisely the reverse order. It follows from this that the appeal to a correspondence of subjective and objective dialectics is again nothing more than a purely external imitation of Hegel, and in no way constitutes a solution of the critical problem of knowledge. In justification of this thesis of the coincidence of dialectic with logic and epistemology, another method is also frequently employed, namely to start off from the principle of the unity of the logical and the historical. According to this, the historical development of human thought proceeds by the formation of various, quote, nodal points, which find their embodiment in philosophical concepts. The logical sequence within the system of philosophy is thereupon alleged to correspond to the genetic sequence of the said nodal points in the history of human practice and human knowledge. Quote, if therefore dialectic, logic, and epistemology are viewed against the background of the history of human knowledge, each of them separately and all of them together turn out to be a schematic representation of the history of human knowledge considered in terms of its nodal points, ... Herein lies the identity of dialectic, logic, and epistemology and dialectical materialism, end quote. Lenin. From this, Lenin also draws in particular the conclusion that epistemology, too, must proceed on historical lines. Quote, dialectics, as understood by Marx and in conformity with Hegel, includes what is now called the theory of knowledge, or epistemology, which, too, must regard its subject matter historically, studying and generalizing the origin and development of knowledge, the transition from non-knowledge to knowledge, end quote. Lenin. This historical treatment of the epistemological problem is justified on the ground that it is impossible to embark on an appraisal of man's capacity for knowledge prior to any concrete act of knowing on his part. Setkovsky endorses Hegel's criticism of Kant that he sought to determine the forms and limits of knowledge prior to and apart from the historical process of knowing. Quote, one cannot learn to swim without jumping into the water. One cannot define the limits of knowledge without overstepping those limits, and one cannot determine the forms of knowledge by isolating oneself from the history and practice of knowledge. The best theory of knowledge, said Hegel, is the history of knowledge, end quote. E.P. Setkovsky. The intrinsically sound conception that it is basically impossible to justify the capacity of knowledge in advance of any concrete act of knowing, and that knowledge can therefore be justified only in its concrete exercise, leads dialectical materialism to the unwarranted conclusion that it is only the historical course of human knowledge that can furnish proof of its legitimacy. For we must distinguish two kinds of experience: the individual experience of the particular knowing subject, and the large-scale experience which mankind acquires in the course of the history of human thought, which we may describe in contrast to the former as macro experience. There is, however, an internal connection between the two. The second is in a certain sense mirrored and reproduced in the first, insofar that is, as the individual recapitulates to some extent in his own development the experience which mankind as a whole has already acquired in the course of mankind's history. Macro experience thereby takes on a significance which should not be underrated in helping to substantiate individual experience as well. In a certain sense, it corroborates the experience of the individual. Despite this, however, it has no meaning apart from individual experience. On the contrary, macro experience presupposes the self-subsistency and primacy of individual experience, and in the absence of the latter, it would hang to some extent in the air. And the reason for this is that historical knowledge, which underlies it, is only immediate knowledge. But in solving the epistemological problem, we have to set out from a cognitive act, in which an immediate unity obtains between the known object and the knowing subject, and this is only the case in an individual act of consciousness. New section, Section 2, The Controversy over Formal Logic. According to Lenin's pronouncement, already referred to, dialectics is supposed to be identical not only with epistemology but also with logic. Now this confronts Soviet philosophy with the question, to what sort of logic is dialectics to be assimilated? To the customary traditional, quote, formal logic of Aristotle, or to a new, quote, dialectical logic? And supposing it is the latter, what is then to become of the traditional formal logic? In, quote, the 30s, that's not the quote. In the 30s, this question was settled out of hand in favor of, quote, dialectical logic. Formal logic was dismissed as, quote, metaphysical, being viewed as the logical foundation of the metaphysical habit of thought, which recognizes only complete unchanging objects and knows nothing of becoming in things or their transformation one into another. For formal logic, as for the metaphysical mode of thought generally, its communication is simply, quote, yeah, nay, for whatsoever is more than these cometh of evil, end quote. In place of this, it was proposed to institute a new, quote, dialectical logic, which should not confine itself, like the traditional logic, to the formal aspect of thought, but was required to take account of the content of knowledge as well. A further and very important difference was also supposed to separate the new logic from its formal predecessor. The traditional logic rests fairly and squarely upon three basic principles: the law of identity, the law of contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. The third law in particular lies at the heart of formal logic. A thing is either A or not A. There can be no third possibility. In radical contrast to this, dialectical logic sets out from the unity of opposites. This was not, however, intended to constitute an immediate rejection of formal logic. Still less did the demand for a dialectical logic imply, even at that time, a denial of the law of contradiction. Footnote. At this time, too, the Soviet philosophers were insistent upon clear definition of concepts and campaigned against, quote, conceptual amorphism, end quote. And B. Mitten. According to Obichkin, it is dialectical logic indeed which makes for clear and definite conclusions. This demand for clarity was founded on an appeal to Lenin. Quote, one may quarrel about tactics, but it is necessary in doing so to proceed with perfect clarity. In all these discussions, the party of the militant class must never lose sight of the necessity for perfectly clear answers to the concrete questions of our political approach, answers which do not admit of two different interpretations. Answers which do not admit of two different interpretations, yes or no. Ought we to do this now, at this moment, or not? End quote. Lenin. End footnote. End footnote. But it was thought of as something barren, a quote sterile flower, end quote. Pust Otzvet, to use an expression of Lenin's. In the introduction to his translation of Engels' Ludwig Feuerbach, Plekhanov was still prepared to grant formal logic a place as a quote moment in dialectical logic. Quote, just as rest is a special case of motion, so thought according to the rules of formal logic, the quote laws of thought, is a special case of dialectical thinking, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. Mitten repudiates this, however. Formal logic cannot be accommodated in dialectical any more than alchemy can be regarded as a subordinate moment in chemistry, or astrology as a subordinate moment in astronomy. Here too, as so often in the realm of Soviet ideology, a radical reversal has lately set in. In November 1946, by a decree of the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party, logic was again introduced into the schools. The publication of new textbooks of formal logic was hastily put in hand. Indeed, for lack of such permission was actually given in 1946 for the provisional use in revised form of a pre-revolutionary textbook by Chelpanov. In 1947, there appeared a textbook by Asmus, but it ran into devastating criticism, quote, on account of its formalism, its acknowledgement of the idealist, quote, logic of relations, end quote, as a sort of last word on the science of logic, end quote. Other attempts, the textbooks of Strogovich and Vinogradov, for example, did not fare much better. A collection of essays on logic was actually confiscated by the Ministry of Higher Education. It can be seen from this that no sort of clarity existed among the Soviet philosophers on the most fundamental issues relating to formal logic. In order to elucidate matters in this field, a series of full-dress discussions was held in 1948, 1949, and 1950 on no less than two occasions, in March and December. At the last of these, the plan of a book by N.I. Kondakov, The Principles of Logic, was dissected in detail, from which it emerged that the Soviet philosophers were more divided in this topic than ever. In the hope of reaching a final conclusion, the editors of Vопроsi Philosophy opened a discussion in the second number of the 1850 volume, which went on for over a year and attracted more than 60 contributions. Whereas it was the reintroduction of formal logic as a teaching subject in secondary schools and colleges, and the consequent need to produce textbooks which provoked the discussion on the theoretical foundations of logic, Stalin's letters on linguistics provided, on the other hand, a number of fixed points which made it easier to furnish a theoretical warrant for formal logic and to demonstrate its title to existence, even from the dialectical materialist point of view. Stalin regards grammar as a science yielding abstract general rules for the formation of words and sentences independently of the content which these words and sentences express. Now, this could also be applied without difficulty to the problem of formal logic, just as could Stalin's remarks about the universal human character of language, which does not have a class character and must be thought of as serving not one class only, but the whole of society of which it is the unifying tie. But this was by no means sufficient to dispose of all the difficulties in the way of establishing formal logic on a philosophical footing from the dialectical materialist point of view. The main obstacle arose from the vacillating approach to formal logic displayed by the classical authorities. On the one hand, it was possible to argue in favor of formal logic and its title to existence by appealing to Engels, in whose Anti-During nothing is left standing of all previous philosophy, except, quote, formal logic and dialectics, end quote. In the Dialectics of Nature, Engels describes formal logic as the, quote, lower mathematics of logic, end quote, a notion which he develops more fully in Anti-During. Quote, even formal logic is primarily a method of arriving at new results, of advancing from the known to the unknown, and dialectics is the same, only in a much more important sense, because in forcing its way beyond the narrow horizon of formal logic, it contains the germ of a more comprehensive view of the world. It is the same with mathematics. Elementary mathematics, the mathematics of constant magnitudes moves within the confines of formal logic. At any rate, taken as a whole, the mathematics of variable magnitudes, whose most important part is the infinitesimal calculus, is in essence nothing other than the application of dialectics to mathematical relations. Anteduring. Lenin, too, in his article, once again on the trade unions, had come out clearly in favor of formal logic. Quote, formal logic which schools confine themselves to, and which with modifications the lower forms should confine themselves to, takes formal definitions and is guided exclusively by what is most customary or most often noted, ... Dialectical logic demands that we go further, ... End quote. Lenin. In justification of the existence of formal logic, weight is also attached to the fact that the works of Marxist classics are themselves permeated by an unanswerable logic. Quote, what captivates me, end quote, says Stalin, quote, in Lenin's speeches, ... was that irresistible force of logic in those speeches which, although somewhat terse, gained a firm hold in his audience, gradually electrified it, and then, as one might say, completely overpowered it, ... End quote. Stalin. But as against this, there are other utterances of the classics, notably Engels, in which formal logic comes off rather badly, and which are accordingly pressed into service by the opponents of formal logic. Thus Engels declares in The Dialectics of Nature, quote, the science of thought is, ... like every other, a historical science, the science of the historical development of human thought, end quote. Engels. And hence, quote, the theory of the laws of thought is by no means a, quote, eternal truth, end quote, established once and for all, as Philistine reasoning imagines to be the case with the word logic, ... But it is precisely dialectics that constitutes the most important form of thinking for present-day natural science, for it alone offers the analog for, and thereby the method of explaining, the evolutionary processes occurring in nature, interconnections in general, and transitions from the one field of investigation to another, end quote. Engels. Quote, fixed categories, according to Engels, retain their validity only for, quote, everyday use, end quote, i.e. in those fields. Quote, where small dimensions or brief periods of time are in question, the limits within which they are usable differ in almost every case and are determined by the nature of the object, end quote. Engels. For all that, Engels concedes that formal logic is not to be regarded simply as, quote, nonsense. In the course of the logical discussion, three tendencies emerged among the Soviet philosophers. The first school supported the possibility of two logics, one formal and the other dialectical, coexisting alongside one another. Parenthesis, M.S. Strogovich, V.I. Cherkasov, the professor of logic at Moscow University, the Leningrad mathematician A.D. Alexandrov, V.P. Rozhin, and others. The second group took the view that there could only be one logic, namely the formal variety, the chief exponent of this outlook being the professor of logic at the University of Tiflis, K.S. Bakradze. Other authors attempted in one way or another to adopt an intermediate position, such as I.I. Ozmakov, P.S. Popov, B.M. Kedrov, and others. The attitude of the first group may be typified in the views expressed by M.S. Strogovich, both in the essay already cited and also in his textbook titled Logic. In Strogovich's opinion, the above-mentioned passage from Lenin's article on the trade unions clearly indicates that the classics explicitly distinguish between a formal and a dialectical logic and consider both to be valid. Hence, the earlier standpoint of Soviet philosophy, such as is still to be found in the Short Philosophical Dictionary, can no longer be maintained, the position that is, that, quote, the laws of formal logic are opposed to those of dialectical logic, end quote, and that formal logic is, quote, empty, impoverished, and abstract, end quote, because the laws and categories it establishes fail to conform to objective reality. The anti-Marxist views of Marr, who describes formal logic as an obsolete stage in the development of human thought, are brilliantly refuted in Stalin's letters on linguistics. Both types of logic, formal and dialectical, are therefore justified, according to Strogovich, and their mutual relationship is so defined that formal logic, as compared with dialectical, represents the lower plane of knowledge. Formal logic, with its four basic laws, identity, contradiction, excluded middle, and sufficient reason, conceives of things statically, in a state of rest, and isolates them one from another. Dialectical logic, on the other hand, reflects motion and development, the unity and conflict of opposites. It is the, quote, subjective dialectics, end quote, which Engels contrasts with, quote, objective dialectics, end quote, the dialectical thought reflecting the motion through opposites which asserts itself everywhere in nature. Quote, dialectic views the phenomena of reality in their development into motion, their connection and reciprocity, but this does not exclude the necessity of taking into consideration their more elementary relationships as well, of regarding them as phenomena possessing, at a specific period in time and under specific conditions, a stable, persistent, and independent character, end quote. M.S. Strogovich. Dialectical logic is related to formal as higher mathematics is to lower, but dialectical logic in no wise upsets the validity of the laws of formal logic. Even dialectical thought is strictly logical in the sense that it allows of no deviation from the laws of formal logic. Though formal logic may be somewhat more imperfect than dialectical, that certainly does not mean that it is, quote, metaphysical, end quote, in character, as its opponents maintain. And though the classics may also have treated formal logic rather contemptuously at times, in limiting it to, quote, everyday use, end quote, or the instruction of lower forms in schools, and again does not mean that they regard it as metaphysics. Engels and Lenin rejected metaphysics, but undoubtedly accepted the validity of formal logic. If they had equated formal logic with metaphysics, this would have meant that they also considered, quote, metaphysics itself to be appropriate for, quote, everyday use, or for lower forms in schools. Cherkasov takes up an essentially similar position, save only that Cherkasov restricts the domain of formal logic to the lower reaches of reality, the sphere of, quote, everyday use, and so differs on this point from Strogovich, who, as we have seen, upholds the validity of the laws of formal logic even in the field of dialectical thought. The position advocated by Bakradze is the diametrical opposite of this. There cannot be two logics alongside one another, one formal and one dialectical, both investigating the same subject matter, namely the forms of thought and inference, and both setting up laws distinct from and in part actually contradictory of one another. Nor can it be the case, as Strogovich maintains, that formal logic deals with the, quote, simple relationships of things, end quote. For in fact, there can be no line drawn between simple and complex relationships among things. Bakradze formulates his own position in the following terms. There is only one logic, properly speaking, having as its objective correct thinking, i.e. thinking which is subject to the laws of identity, contradiction, etc. Dialectical logic is not a theory of the laws and forms of correct thinking. The classics identify dialectical logic with dialectics as such. This is what Lenin means when he speaks of the fact that logic, dialectics, and epistemology coincide. Hence, it is not formal logic that must be contrasted with dialectical logic, but only logic proper, as the theory of correct thinking, with dialectics, which as the theory of higher laws of development in nature, society, and human thought, also function as an epistemology and decide such questions as the following. Is knowledge in general possible? What is knowledge? What is truth? What is the criterion thereof, etc.? Logic is thus a moment in dialectics conceived as epistemology. For according to Lenin, the process of knowledge is the transition, quote, from living intuition to abstract thought, and from thence to practice, end quote. Lenin. Though correct thinking plays an essential part in this, on the other hand, logic is also dependent on dialectics. Thus, the view we take of the relation of universal to particular is of decisive importance for the rules of deductive inference. For if everyone denies the reality of the universal, he has no right to assume the validity of deductive inference. For Bakradze, too, logic is not class conditioned but holds good for all men. So far as Engels' contemptuous remarks about formal logic are concerned, and Engels' restriction of the latter to the field of, quote, everyday use, these observations refer only to formal logic as corrupted by metaphysics. But it is essentially wrong to suppose that formal logic depicts the laws of metaphysical thought. Among those who adopt a middle position, P.S. Popov takes the view that there can only be one logic. Formal and dialectical logic merely represent two different stages of one and the same logic. Even in the dialectical sphere, the law of formal logic still retain their validity, while conversely, dialectical logic is already applicable even to the most elementary phenomena in reality. Hence, neither can be wrenched apart from the other. Osmakov makes a distinction between the logic of thought and the science of logic. The logic of thought is a copy of the logic of things in human consciousness. Hence, the logic of thought's universal human character, its validity for all men and all orders of society, it cannot possess a class character. Like language, it is a medium of understanding between men. But whereas language is ordinarily a bond of union only for a single people, logic constitutes a unifying tie for the whole of human society throughout all nations. Thus, there cannot be a number of different kinds of logic, formal, dialectical, inductive, etc., but only the one logic of thought reflecting the logic of things. Lenin's assertion as to the unity of logic and dialectics applies only to this logic of thought. Logic and dialectics are here inseparable. Logic of thought characterizes the activity of the understanding, whereas dialectical relates to that of reason, signifying a penetration of consciousness into the inwardness of objects and phenomena in nature and social life, a pursuit of the latter in their change and development. With the science of logic, the situation is different. In Osmakov's opinion, it certainly has a class character. Here, too, there is recourse to the distinction between formal and dialectical logic. Formal logic represents a stage in the development of the science of logic, namely the stage of bourgeois science. Soviet logic cannot be metaphysical as formal logic is. It must be dialectical. All the same, there is no need to call it, quote, dialectical, unquote. That is superfluous, because all genuine science has a dialectical character, and it could easily lead to confusion with dialectical materialism. It is best described as logic tout court. Moreover, in decreeing the reintroduction of logic into the schools, the Central Committee did not call for instruction in formal logic, but for instruction in logic as such, which must be dialectical in character. This discussion was concluded by an editorial postscript in the 6th number of the 1951 volume of Vопроsi Philosophy. The official and generally prescribed standpoint was summed up under the following heads. Logic does not belong to the superstructure and therefore has no class character, but is common to all classes and nations. Quote, the forms and laws of thought are a reflection of one and the same objective reality, resulting from the numberless repetitions of man's practical activity, end quote. The logical structure of thought and the laws thereof are continually changing, but gradually as language does without, quote, explosions. Formal and dialectical logic both have a title to acceptance. The former is the science of the elementary laws and forms of correct thinking, and is such needful not only for the student but for everybody. Dialectical logic is a qualitatively new and higher stage in the development of thought, the logic of which Lenin was speaking when he declared it to be identical with dialectic and epistemology. It sets out the organic connection between the laws and forms of thought and the laws of the objective world. But this did not by any means provide a final solution to the problem of logic in Soviet philosophy. Until Stalin's death, to be sure, the situation remained quiet. It would appear, however, that the subsequent change in the ideological, quote, atmosphere put new heart into the champions of formal logic, so that they felt emboldened to renew their attempt to gain recognition of their point of view. This emerges from the fact that whenever the official organs have had occasion to review recent work in Soviet philosophy, the neglect of dialectical logic has repeatedly been referred to as a major defect. For fear lest the revival of this group, who regarded formal logic as the only logic, should lead to a complete swamping of dialectical logic by formal, the editors of Vопроsi Philosophy, in a leading article in the 3rd number of the 1955 volume, delivered a violent attack on the two ringleaders of the opposing faction, K.S. Bakradze and N.I. Kondakov. The excuse for this was the appearance of the latter's book, Logic, which was published in 1954 under the imprint of the Academy of Sciences of the USSR. They also seized the occasion to pass further judgment on Bakradze's Logic, published in 1951, despite the fact that it had already been reviewed in Vопроsi Philosophy in 1952. Bakradze's book again denies the existence of two logics. There is only one, namely formal logic. The author endeavors to show that the most important proposition in Marxist dialectics, most important propositions, plural, in Marxist dialectics are basically applications of the rules of formal logic. Thus, the principle of excluded middle, for example, is in no way contradictory of the dialectic, which proceeds from the very fact that the classics of Marxism always made use of this principle. Bakradze also points out very properly the basis of the whole misunderstanding. The Soviet philosophers erroneously suppose that the explanation of motion and development in the world calls for a special, quote, dialectical logic. Quote, the logical law of identity implies no denial of either change or development, end quote. Kondakov's book on logic also takes the view that there can be only one logic, namely formal. When the classics of Marxism speak of a, quote, dialectical logic, end quote, they are thinking of Marxism as a whole and not of any one part of dialectical materialism. He attempts to prove that the passages cited from the classics as examples of the application of a dialectical logic are wholly in accordance with the laws of formal logic. In pursuit of this, he offers a very clear-cut statement of the law of contradiction, quote, two opposed judgments cannot be both be true and of one and the same object, considered at one and the same time and in one and the same respect. Unquote. Obviously, to avoid the reproachment of indulging in metaphysics and banishing contradiction from the real world, Kondakov formulates the law of contradiction not in its Aristotelian form. Quote, the same attribute cannot at the same time belong and not belong to the same subject and in the same respect, end quote, but as a mere law of thought. In spite of this, he was heavily attacked in the article referred to by the editors of Vопроsi Philosophy. The very fact of this having framed the law of contradiction as a law of thought led to an accusation of separating the laws of thought from the laws of being. But the main reproach directed against him as against Bakradze was that of denying the existence of dialectical logic and recognizing the validity of formal logic alone. The violence of the reaction among the defenders of dialectical logic was doubtless due to the fact that in the meantime, the position taken by Bakradze and Kondakov had attracted quite a number of supporters among the Soviet logicians. At the time of the logic discussion in 1950 to 51, Bakradze had stood almost alone, but now as the editorial in Vопроsi Philosophy complains, his views are no longer, quote, the private vagaries of an aberrant logician, end quote, but a, quote, pernicious tendency, obstinately defended by a number of our logicians, end quote. The collective problems of logic produced by the Philosophical Institute in 1955 also shares the outlook of Bakradze and Kondakov, and so too, say the aggrieved editors, does the collective book Logic, issued under the same auspices. Not only so, but formal logic has played a far more conspicuous part in philosophical literature, and not in articles only, but also in special monographs, whereas dialectical logic can point only to a few contributions, mainly in article form. It is typical, however, of the present ideological situation in the Soviet Union that these violent attacks by the, quote, dialecticians should have had not the smallest effect in persuading the supporters of formal logic, and least of all, Professor Bakradze, to lower their colors. On the contrary, Bakradze and Kondakov published open letters in Vопроsi Philosophy protesting against the aspersions cast upon them. And doubtless at the former's instigation, the professors and lecturers in dialectical and historical materialism at the University of Tiflis also, which is Tbilisi now, also demurred against the claim, but put forward in several articles in Vопроsi Philosophy that the problem of the interrelations of logic and dialectics had ceased to be worth discussing, since it had already received a clear-cut solution to in the teachings of Marxism. To this they replied not only that they had no intention of breaking off the discussion at this point, but that, on the contrary, they were proposed to extend it on to a still broader front. At present, the controversy is still in full spate. The fundamental misconception which has induced a number of Soviet philosophers to excogitate their own dialectical logic is clearly brought out by Bakradze, when Bakradze insists that the law of identity involves no denial of change or development. The supporters of dialectical logic were afraid lest motion and change should fail to be comprehended under the static concepts and laws of formal logic, and they therefore sought to assimilate thought with dialectic so that the laws and categories of thought might also participate in the dynamism which animates the objective world. But in order to accommodate a changing and developing subject, it is by no means necessary for logical concepts and laws of thought to be themselves subject to change and development. An example will make this clear. In order to reflect a moving body, it is not necessary for the mirror itself to move. On the contrary, if it is also moved along with the moving body, and if in addition they both share the same velocity, the mirror image will certainly reproduce the body, but not the body's motion. Indeed, the body will remain stationary in the mirror. Similarly, it is unnecessary for categories of thought and the whole logical structure of human thinking to move and change in order for them to be able to grasp the motion and change in objective reality. New section, section 3. One second. As just seen, the official line in Soviet philosophy seeks to supplement the traditional formal logic by a new and dialectical one. It would therefore be interesting to learn how this dialectical logic appears in detail. But here, unfortunately, everything is still too much at the stage of preliminary studies to make it possible to attempt an outline of a dialectical logic of this kind. The logic textbooks mainly confine themselves, as we have already noted, to reproducing the doctrines of formal logic in regard to concepts, judgment, inference, and so forth. To be sure, as early as 1944, Tavanets had demanded the replacement of formal logic by a logic, quote, imbued with content, and quote, in which the categories of formal logic, which abstracts from content, should be subjected to a revision in the light of dialectic. But he confines his reformation of, quote, traditional, unquote, logic to what are essentially matters of detail, such as a rearrangement in the classification of judgments, the recasting of the modalities of inference, etc. Yet certain beginnings towards a, quote, dialectical logic are discernible nonetheless. One has to go back here in the first place to Engels' Dialectics of Nature, but a number of other of such attempts can be found among more recent authors as well. In what follows, we shall be giving a brief account of these rudiments, and in doing so, we shall follow the example of the Soviet philosophers who declined to separate the, quote, logical state of knowledge, and quote, from the, quote, sensory, by refusing to confine ourselves merely to thought contents proper, concepts, judgments, and inferences, and making some preliminary observations about sensation, perception, and representation as well. Sensation, according to Soviet Dialectical Materialism, is the, quote, result of the operation of external objects upon our sense organs, a product of a particular mode of organization in matter, end quote. F.I. Kask-Hachik. For Lenin, as we already know, it is the, quote, transformation of the energy of external excitation into a state of consciousness, end quote. Lenin. Soviet philosophy considers it the sole starting point of all knowledge. Quote, Marxist philosophical materialism teaches that the source of all our knowledge lies in sensation. The sense organs are the only channels whereby the external world makes entry into our consciousness. A man deprived of all his sense organs cannot be in any way acquainted with the world. A person having no sensation of anything knows nothing and understands nothing. End quote. F.I. Kask-Hachik. Stalin, too, in his letters on linguistics, stressed the impossibility of thought without a basis of sensation. Dialectical materialism is therefore entirely at one on this point with the Lockean nihil est in intellectu quod non prius fuerit in sensu, though it objects to the sensationalist interpretation of this statement, which Locke meant to be understood as implying the denial of any essential difference between sensory and logical knowledge. Dialectical materialism considers the difference between its own standpoint and that of pre-Marxian materialism to consist primarily in its employment in this field also of the principle of historicism. Sensation also develops like everything else in the world. Better developed sense organs also yield better knowledge, but the progress of sensation is bound up in a special degree with the development of technology and the means of production. Technical aids enable us to make our sensations sharper and more exact. The naked eye perceives about 5,500 stars, whereas the telescope can take in upwards of 100 million, or to extend them into regions which would otherwise remain completely inaccessible to perception, the inner world of the atom. Rutkiewicz even considers the progress of culture and productive techniques to be responsible for a physiological sharpening of our sensations. The delicacy of the capacity of discriminating colors is supposed to increase with the development of the dyeing industry. The various qualities of sensation sight, hearing, touch, etc., are conditioned on the one hand by differences in the objective structure of the world, and on the other by differences in the organization of the sense organs. This diversity among our sense impressions should not, however, be taken in too absolute a fashion, for each of our various senses gives expression to reality in its own peculiar manner. Moreover, there is also a certain interconnection between them, and that they can often replace and even rectify one another. Thus, the sensory illusion to which the eye is subject when it sees a stick dipped in water is broken can be corrected by feeling with the hands. But sensation, as Soviet philosophy sees it, must not be interpreted as a purely passive affair. It is not just a passive reflex, but also implies at the same time an active attitude on the part of the knower. Besides this active attitude of the knower in sensation, it also possesses another essential feature, which dialectical materialism upholds against the mechanistic viewpoint, namely its social character, to which reference has already been made above. Quote, sensations, are always the sensations of man, the social being. The sensations of social man are always mediated by man's social being, by his social consciousness as a whole, The sense perceptions of social man are mediated by his previous experience, by his practice, by the practice of his class as a whole, end quote. G. Obichkin. In the emphasis thus placed upon the social character of sensation, and in the historical mode of approach already referred to, one may discern what is perhaps the characteristic difference in treatment of this question between, quote, dialectical logic and the traditional view. The next higher stage after sensation is perception. In nature, there are in fact no, quote, pure properties, but only complete objects. So too in our sensory knowledge, we are also concerned not with, quote, pure sensations isolated one from another, but with sensations organically dovetailed as components into the perception of a total object. Perception is the result of this analytico-synthetic activity of the cerebral cortex and, quote, gives man awareness of a thing as a total object with its particularities, properties, and relations, end quote. F.I. Georgiev. In adopting this view of the perceptual process, dialectical materialism aims to do away with atomistic sensualism. On the other hand, the Soviet psychologists are continually inveighing in this connection against Gestalt psychology, and especially against Kuhler and Kofka, who are accused of having, quote, made a mystery, end quote, of the totalistic character of perception. Footnote: Gestalt psychology emphasizes the total character of our sensory perception. The whole, for it, is more than the part, inasmuch as Gestalt perception is not exhausted by the mere sum of partial perceptions. The Berlin school saw in this Gestalt experience a mere reflection of the physical Gestalt in the stimuli and brain processes, whereas others have sought to explain it by the intervention of various intellectual functions. End footnote. It is interesting to find Soviet dialectical materialism of the opinion that the occurrence of perception involves recourse to previous sensory and intellectual knowledge. Quote, sense perceptions in man are interspersed with intellectual activity. I look at a given object and perceive it as a clock. I take it for a clock on this occasion because the idea of a clock has already arisen in me on the basis of previous experience. This means that in perceiving objects and phenomena, man already had a certain stock of knowledge in the shape of representation and concepts which operate as premises in the knowing process, though they are really a result of the history of knowledge and practice. End quote. F.I. Kaskachik. The next stage above perception in the knowing process is representation. It is the link between sense perception and concept, the elementary form of generalization. Like sensation, it is a subjective picture of the objective world, but differs from sensation in that it is no longer so immediately dependent on the object sensed, since in this case the process of the object is no longer necessary. It still adheres to the sensory form of the object, but already omits certain details and is confined to whatever happens to strike the eye for any reason, even though it may not be by any means the most important thing. In this respect, it differs from the concept which singles out the essential features of the object. With the concept, the knowing process ascends to a new and higher level, namely the quote, logical, which differs qualitatively, i.e. essentially from that of the senses. The concept, too, is a subjective picture of objective reality, but unlike sensation and representation, it is no longer sensory in character, but, quote, logical or, quote, thought created. The concept is no longer tied to the material order. Quote, hence it can neither be contemplated nor represented. Value, for instance, cannot be apprehended by the sense organs. Any individual commodity can be touched and seen, but value can neither be seen with the eyes, nor heard with the ears, nor felt with the hands, for as Lenin says, it is a category that is not bound to the matter of sensory experience. End quote. F.I. Kaskachik. Hence, too, the scope of the concept is incomparably greater than that of sensation or perception. What Lenin declared of the concept of velocity, namely that it can and must embrace speeds beyond the limits of imagination, is equally true of many concepts of modern physics. Think, for example, of the microparticles of quantum physics, or even of the so-called radio stars, which cannot be observed at all by the optical methods, but of which modern astronomy is capable of framing a still admittedly incomplete concept. As regards the formation of general concepts, we have already indicated above that dialectical materialism adheres to a perfectly acceptable theory of abstraction. The dialectical character of the theory of concepts is supposed to be guaranteed in particular by two special features in the view taken of them: the rejection of, quote, fixed, unalterable concepts, and the doctrine of the, quote, concrete concept, end quote. Whereas, quote, metaphysics regards concepts as absolute, fixed, and unchanging, dialectics considers them to be essentially mutable in character. They possess a flexibility extending even to the identity of opposites. If this were not so, they could not reflect a world itself conceived as in a state of perpetual flux. Quote, assuming that everything develops, does this also extend to the most general concepts and categories of thought? If not, that means that thought has no connection with being. If it is so, then this means that there is a dialectic of concepts and a dialectic of knowledge having objective significance, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. I cannot say that guy's name. Or her name, I don't know if it's a he or she. V.I. Cherkasov points, as an example of such mutable dialectical concepts, to the notion of a, quote, revolutionary mass, end quote. According to Lenin, it is sufficient at the outset of a revolutionary struggle that some thousands of workers should begin to engage in revolutionary activity in order to be able to speak of a, quote, mass. Later, when the revolutionary movement has spread sufficiently to turn it into a true revolution, this is no longer enough. The concept of, quote, mass has changed. It now signifies the majority, and that not only the majority of the workers, but of all the dispossessed. Mutable concepts of this sort, according to Cherkasov, also include such concepts as, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, and, quote, biological species, and, quote, the, quote, boiling point of water at 100 degrees Celsius, end quote. Cherkasov describes them as, quote, concepts of changing relations, end quote. They are not confined to the enumeration of essential features isolated from the inessential, for the essence of things cannot be reduced to a sum of unalterable features. Since it is always developing and changing, it incorporates rather a contradiction within itself, which can only be reproduced in our consciousness by a dialectically contradictory concept. A really profound scientific concept must therefore include in its content the general, the necessary, and the lawful, unseparated and unisolated from the opposed categories of the individual, the contingent, the particular, etc. In the concept of, quote, biological species, for example, the individual variants included under the species in question are not set aside and forgotten, but incorporated into it as quote, its other, end quote. Thanks to its dialectical interconnection of general and particular, this concept leads the biologist to reckon in advance with the possibility and even the necessity that new species may emerge from the old, and that under given conditions the essential may be transformed into the inessential and vice versa. The formation of such a concept does not occur by way of an enumeration of all the individual features and instances. So far as that goes, it would merely prove that the general is sometimes realized in a specific form, that events do indeed repeat themselves, albeit with certain variations. It is precisely on this account that the dialectical concept enables man to grasp the concreteness of truth and of the actual situation, which has its special importance from the point of view of revolutionary tactics. Cherkasov's examples show very clearly, however, the misconception underlying this doctrine of the dialectical concept. When new species arise from an earlier one, leaving aside the question whether such processes actually occur, it is obviously not a matter of the species concept having altered, but of certain organisms having so far altered in the course of evolution that they no longer belong to this particular species. Again, if a few thousand workers can form a, quote, revolutionary mass, end quote, in one particular historical situation, but not in another, this does not mean that the concept is altered, but that it also includes as one of its features a relation to the environment. If this relation is altered, and on another occasion, by a shift in the balance of power, say, it may come about that the concept of, quote, revolutionary mass is no longer applicable to a few thousand workers. The same applies to the dialectical materialist doctrine of the, quote, concrete concept, end quote, by which is meant not merely the concreteness of the individual concept, but a concreteness in the concept of the universal, and even of the type. The Hegelian legacy is again in evidence here, for in his Science of Logic, Hegel had set himself this very goal of overcoming the abstract universality of the concept in formal logic, which becomes ever more impoverished in content the more its scope increases, and replacing it by the concrete concept as the expression of a concrete universality, including within itself all the wealth of its subordinate concepts. Quote, "It is only through a profounder acquaintance with other sciences," end quote, says Hegel in his introduction to the logic, quote, "that logic discovers itself to subjective thought as not a mere abstract universal, but as a universal which comprises in itself the full wealth of particulars," end quote. Hegel. Like the passages from Hegel's logic on, quote, self-movement, which we referred to earlier, this idea also put Lenin into a state of high enthusiasm. Of the quotations cited above, he remarks in his philosophical notebooks, quote, "a splendid formula, quote, not a mere abstract universal," end quote, but a universal containing in itself the wealth of the particular, the individual, the singular, ... Très bien, end quote. Lenin. This idea, when fully worked out, should indeed have led to the replacement of traditional formal logic by a new dialectical logic, as Hegel himself intended it should. But how does dialectical materialism set about solving this problem on a materialist basis? How is this unity of universal, particular, and singular to be realized? In the fragment on dialectics, Lenin gives the following, quote, dialectical account of the unity of universal and particular. Quote, "consequently, opposites, the singular as opposed to the general, are identical. The singular exists only in the connection that leads to the general. The general exists only in the singular and through the singular. Every singular is, in one way or another, a general. Every general is a fragment or a side of the essence of a singular. Every general only approximately comprises all the singular objects, ... Every singular is connected by thousands of transitions with other kinds of singulars, things, phenomena, processes, etc. End quote. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks. In this formulation, which is not distinguished by undue precision, Lenin appears to regard the identity of general and singular in the concrete concept in such a way that a real connection only obtains between individual concrete things. No more happy are the attempted solutions put forward by the Soviet philosophers. In most cases, the concreteness of the general concept is derived from the unity of general, particular, and singular, which is not only attributed to things in objective reality, but also required of concepts. Hachik thinks that every definition of a concept involves three moments. Quote, the general, the species, the particular, determinacy of the species, and the singular, defined object, end quote. But this does not prevent him, a few lines later, from explaining that, quote, the concept, quote, animal, is formed by leaving aside what distinguishes animals from one another and retaining only what is common to all of them, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. Further on still, he gives a quite different account of the, quote, concreteness, end quote, of a concept. Quote, a concept which reflects the really existing world is a concrete concept. A concrete concept, end quote. By, quote, concrete, he here means, following Marx, quote, the union of many determinations, a unity of multiplicity, end quote, and gives an example of the Stalinist definition of the concept of, quote, nation. Quote, a nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture, end quote. Stalin. This, quote, concrete concept, end quote, too, is supposed, like every other, to represent a, quote, unity of general, particular, and singular, end quote. But when Kaskachik attempts to illustrate this claim by an example, the singular tacitly drops out of sight once more. Quote, the concept, quote, apple tree, for example, simultaneously designates the common element characteristic of all trees and the particular features peculiar to fruit trees, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. For Sitkovsky, the concrete concept is imbued with content because it incorporates its negation, quote, its other, a dialectical contradiction within itself. Here he is thinking primarily of the, quote, categories of dialectical materialism, which are mostly listed in pairs, because each of them contains in its content and definition the category contradictorily opposed to it. Since the concrete concept, therefore, has a highly complicated dialectical content, it also includes the judgment which gives expression to this content. It is to some extent a compendium or condensate of the many judgments which have gone to make it up. Keb-Uriah has lately attempted to found the concreteness of the concept on a variety of other grounds as well. The concept for him is concrete insofar as it represents a, quote, nodal point in the historical development of knowledge. The latter gives rise to a continuously increasing enrichment of the concept, i.e. a continual growth in concreteness. The concept of the atom in contemporary physics differs, for example, from that of the ancient Greeks by its greater content, depth, and definiteness, quote, i.e. by its greater concreteness, end quote. This concrete character of the concept is further governed by the fact that it reflects the essence of the object. For the essence is concrete because it represents the unity of a multiplicity, namely the, quote, wholeness of the essential features, end quote. And finally, he considers this concreteness to be still further conditioned by the fact that it represents the result of a, quote, scientific generalization, end quote. Hence, unlike the, quote, metaphysical theory, however, the Marxist theory of the concept regards generalization as a process in which thought moves from the simple to the complex, and from the abstract to the concrete. The concept of, quote, capitalism, for example, is characterized by a whole series of determinations: goods, money, capital, surplus value, profit, etc. But in defining capitalism, all these individual determinations must not be mechanically listed together in a row, but developed one from another, as Marx does in Capital. From all the above-mentioned examples of, quote, concrete concepts, it will be clearly evident that they are in no need of any new, quote, dialectical logic. The concepts of formal logic also reflect the real existing world. They also represent the unity of a multiplicity of features, and they are also often the result of a series of judgments and gain in depth of content through the progress of science. The speculations of those who champion concrete concepts are often founded on a confusion between the various types of general concept. Thus, when formal logicians lay it down as a law of the general concept, that the more its scope is enlarged, the poorer it grows in content, it is the generic concept that they have in mind. Now, though modern logic may still be far from possessing any universally acknowledged scheme for classifying general concepts, there is agreement on this much at least, that in addition to the generic concept proper, there is also a whole series of other types of general concept, such as collective concepts, inclusive concepts, e.g., quote, the Renaissance, quote, capitalism, serial concepts, which designate a series, such as the, quote, spectrum, and so on. When the Soviet philosophers offer as examples of the, quote, concrete universal, unquote, such concepts as, quote, nation, quote, working class, etc., what we are dealing with here are not generic concepts, but collective or inclusive concepts, which even according to the laws of formal logic are by no means attenuated. In content, the wider their scope is extended. Thus, the concept of, quote, fleet, for example, is not diminished in content the more ships the fleet contains. In its account of judgment, Soviet philosophy insists with Engels that dialectical logic, unlike formal, must not be content with enumerating the individual forms of motion of thought, judgment, and inference, and placing them side by side without any connection. Dialectical logic, on the contrary, must derive these forms out of one another and establish a relation of subordination between them instead of putting them on an equal level. Hegel's four groups of judgments of inherence, judgments of subsumption, judgments of necessity, and judgments of the notion, are reduced by Engels to three: individual judgments, Hegel's judgments of inheritance; special judgments, Hegel's judgments of subsumption and necessity; and general judgments, Hegel's judgments of the notion. In Engels' opinion, this subordination of judgments, the progression from individual to particular, and from particular to universal, reflects the historical development of human knowledge. He shows this by way of the following example, quote, that friction produces heat was already known practically to prehistoric man, who discovered the making of fire by friction perhaps more than 100,000 years ago, ... But from that to the discovery that friction is in general a source of heat, who knows how many thousands of years elapsed? Enough that the time came when the human brain was sufficiently developed to be able to formulate the judgment, friction is a source of heat. Friction is a source of heat. ... Still further thousands of years passed until, in 1842, Mayer, Joule, and Holding, ... formulated the judgment, all mechanical motion is capable of being converted into heat by means of friction. All mechanical motion is capable of being converted into heat by means of friction, ... But from now on, things went quickly. Only 3 years later, Mayer was able, ... to raise the judgment of subsumption to the level at which it now stands. Any form of motion, under conditions fixed for each case, is both able and compelled to undergo transformation, directly or indirectly, into any other form of motion. Any form of motion under conditions fixed for each case is both able and compelled to undergo transformation, directly or indirectly, into any other form of motion, Engels. According to Kopnin, the most elementary form of thought is not the concept, but the judgment. The concept he considers to be a judgment, whose predicate represents the thought of the general within the phenomena, Kopnin. Kopnin also believes that unlike formal logic, dialectical logic is not confined to the question of the validity of the judgment, but also provides a method for determining whether a given judgment is true. Alexeyev distinguishes between elementary judgments such as, quote, Ivan is a man, whose formulation requires no acquaintance with dialectical logic, even though a dialectic is present within them, and dialectical judgments which can only be formulated by use of the dialectical method. As an example of such a judgment, he quotes a remark from Marx's Capital, quote, Capital, therefore, cannot originate out of circulation, and yet it is no less impossible that it should originate apart from circulation. Consequently, capital must arise both in circulation and not in circulation, end quote. In circulation, because only therein their purchase of that specific commodity, namely labor power, which creates surplus value, not in circulation but in production, because labor power only creates surplus value in the labor process. But in this sense, we should equally have to call, quote, the Danube flows through Austria and does not flow through Austria, end quote, a dialectical judgment, since besides flowing through Austria, it flows through various other countries. It is not difficult to see, however, that formal logic can also make short work of, quote, dialectical judgments of this sort. It is not in judgment only, but also in inference, that Soviet philosophy sees a copy of the processes, interconnections, and reciprocal relations prevailing among objects in reality. According to Kaskachik, the various forms of syllogism reproduce the relations obtaining among things. Quote, the logical figures with which logic normally operates give expression to real relations and connections among things. Just as the connections and relations among things are numerous and manifold, so too are the forms of inference, end quote. F.I. Kaskachik. Lenin goes further still and even maintains that the logical validity of inference is derived from experience. Quote, when Hegel tries ... to subsume the purposeful activity of man under the categories of logic by saying that this activity is, quote, inference, that the subject man plays the part of a, quote, term in the logical, quote, figure of the argument, etc. This is not just a forced conclusion, not just a game. On the contrary, it has a very deep, purely materialistic meaning. One must put the matter the other way round. Man's consciousness must have been led by his practical activity to recapitulate the various logical figures millions and millions of times, in order for these figures to have acquired the significance of axioms. It is precisely and solely on the strength of these millions of repetitions that the figures themselves possess the fixity of preconceived notions and an axiomatic character, end quote. Lenin. Since dialectical materialism conceives of inference as the production of a process and connection occurring in things themselves, the, quote, conclusion from ideas, end quote, being simply a copy of the, quote, conclusion from things, end quote, it regards the procedure of inference as a means of acquiring new knowledge. The conclusion gives us knowledge that we should not have had from the premises alone. Furthermore, the conclusion can either produce what is past. From the fact that large quantities of shells were found in the Alps, it could be inferred that at some earlier time, the Alpine rocks were once at the bottom of the sea, or else be a means of foreseeing events still impending in the future. But this latter claim is scarcely in keeping with Lenin's thesis that the logical validity of inference reposes on the millionfold repetition of the experience which accords with it. For if logical validity does not depend on the knowledge of an unchanging essence contained in the premises, which does not first require a millionfold repetition of experience for its discovery, and such that the connection expressed in the conclusion necessarily follows from it, one may legitimately ask on what other basis foreknowledge of the future can be supposed to be possible. According to the direction in which inference proceeds, a distinction must be made between induction and deduction. In induction, inference thought proceeds from the particular to the general, in deductive, on the other hand, from the general to the particular. Both forms have their own justification and meaning. Whereas, quote, metaphysical thinking separates the two from one another, dialectical materialism regards them not as mutually exclusive methods, but as forms of thought which supplement and condition one another. Deduction is said to have particular importance in the field of mathematics and geometry. By the use of this method, the whereabouts of the planet Neptune were calculated by Leverrier in 1846, some years before its discovery by Gall, Galle. Even so, the importance of deduction should not be exaggerated, for awareness of generality, concepts, laws, is not the starting point, but the outcome of the history of knowledge. Deduction therefore presupposes induction, whose task is precisely that of ascending from the singular to the general. Kopman, on the other hand, rightly emphasizes that induction without deduction is impossible, and this because, quote, induction alone is incapable of explaining the process of inductive inference. Every inference, including induction, proceeds on the basis of knowledge of generality, unquote. Like induction and deduction, the method of analysis and synthesis must also complement one another, according to dialectical materialism, and form a unity, in order not to lapse into the errors of, quote, metaphysical thinking. Argument by analogy is likewise reckoned to be justified under certain conditions, assuming, that is, that the qualitative peculiarities of the phenomena under comparison are taken into account. These are some of the indications pointing in the direction of a consciously designed, quote, dialectical logic. No complete and rounded treatment of the subject has yet been vouchsafed to us. The dialectical method of dealing with individual thought contents emerges most clearly in the sections on concepts and on judgment, but we feel compelled to endorse the opinions of those Soviet philosophers who maintain that the matters brought into issue by the champions of, quote, dialectical logic can all be equally well dealt with by means of the traditional logic. And that's the end of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.